The other side of the road is safe, where we sidestep being bothered and avoid getting involved. But rolling up your sleeves and boldly going where few dare to tread, that's walking through Samaria. Each week on our podcast, we introduce you to the special few who walk in the spirit of the Good Samaritan. On behalf of the Giving Company and your hosts, David Hendrickson and Dan Riveros, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. This is David Hendrickson with co-host
Dan Riveros.
And we are here in person, Dan, you and I,
Yep.
in Alpharetta, Georgia.
Here,
Before Thanksgiving, and I guess we should do a shout out like, everybody have a safe Thanksgiving.
Please, that's
responsible.
That's all.
There's a lot of rules this year for Thanksgiving, but it can still be enjoyed. Dan, we have a very cool guest on today.
We do. Tell us about her, man.
Well, the first thing that I have to say is that she's an opinion editor.
Wow.
She's a journalist. So you know what that means?
Responsibility.
We're going to get doxxed, I bet. Before this is over, we're going to get doxxed.
Probably.
I'm totally kidding. I want to welcome Batya Ungar-Sargon to the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Batya, it's great to have you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
I'm totally kidding about the doxing thing because that's not your style. That's not what you would do. It's just a little Walking Through Samaria humor here to get us started. Well, Batya, you're in Brooklyn, New York, huh?
I am, yes, and I'm thrilled to be with you. Thank you so much.
Is it cold and snowy and quarantined in Brooklyn?
It's cold and, half quarantine, half in, half out, depending really on who you voted for. I would say.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's going to be fun kind of having this conversation because I'm not sure our listeners at this point know kind of all the connection points that you have with Giving Company and with this podcast. But if you don't mind, I'd like to start reading your bio.
Sure.
And I want to tell our listeners, Batya is very humble, and she gave me like 2 sentences. So, Dan, I had to do my normal online stalking to get some more information on Batya here. But here we go. Batya Ungar-Sargon is the opinion editor of The Forward, the largest Jewish media company in America. She came to The Forward from VinePair, where she was the managing editor. Prior to that, she worked for Tablet Magazine. She has written articles for the Times of Israel, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the New York Review, and many others. Here's one of the really cool things. She was recently announced as a member of the Civil Society Fellowship Class of 2021. This is a partnership between the Anti-Defamation League and the Aspen Institute. The fellowship, which is part of the Aspen Global Leadership Network, aims to prepare and engage the next generation of community and civic leaders, activists, and problem solvers from across the political spectrum. She has a PhD from Berkeley, Dan.
Berkeley.
After she attended high school in Israel and college in the United States. Batya, again, welcome to the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, Batya, first question, how smart are you? Just give us, come on. Where'd you go to college?
I went to University of Chicago. But
another super smart place like Berkeley.
I do want to say, I feel like I'm on a war against, the snobbery of experts and expertise, especially in journalism. So I a little bit resist this characterization.
Okay.
Well, University of Chicago is a pretty impressive place. I lived in downtown Chicago when I was going to Kellogg, and so that is a great school. And obviously, having a PhD from Berkeley is amazing as well. But you grew up in Israel, and I did a little research, and the name Batya means daughter of God in Hebrew. Can you tell us a little bit about growing up in Israel, how that shaped your faith and your worldview?
Sure. I always joke and say, my name means daughter of God because my father thinks he's God.
That's good.
There you go.
That's
appropriately
good.
named.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's actually, it's kind of like an old lady's name. It's very much out of fashion. I'm named after my great-grandmother. But I carry this name with a lot of pride.
Yeah.
And it really does remind me every time someone says my name of, the most, that sort of connection. So I grew up in a very, very Orthodox family. Do your listeners, are your listeners familiar with the sort of different factions of the Jewish community?
Could probably use a little background if you don't mind.
Sure. So there's about 14 million Jews on this planet. Half of them live in Israel, half of them live in America. The community in Israel is split between a majority secular, like completely irreligious community, and then you have a small faction of like ultra-Orthodox Jews, and then you have Mizrahi Jews who came from Arab countries, and they're more traditional. So they'll sort of, light candles on Shabbat, but they won't observe to the same extent as the Orthodox.
Okay.
So that's the Israeli community. In America, what you have is sort of four main factions. You have the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox who are super observant. They keep kosher, they keep Shabbos, so they have very strict restrictions on what they can eat. They have their own restaurants. There's no technology on Shabbos from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. And you'll recognize them because the men often dress in black and white. You then have the conservative who are a little bit more permissive. They observe, but not to the same degree. And then you have the reform who they don't quite observe the rules, but they still have that connection with God. And then you have a big portion of the community that's sort of completely irreligious. They call themselves Jews of no religion. So you might wonder, well, what makes them Jewish? Well, so Judaism is both a religion and an ethnicity. It's passed down from, mother or father.
Wow. Okay.
So it's sort of very complicated. It's very hard to, understand. On the one hand, some people consider it to be a religion. On the other hand, some people consider it just to be their ethnicity and their culture. So I was born here. At age 11, my parents took us to Israel. So I was very much a fish out of water. And then when I came back, when I lived there, I was very much an American Jew living in Israel.
Wow.
And then I came back here and I was very much sort of an almost Israeli Jew living in America. So it gave me sort of this
You've had both sides. That's amazing.
Exactly. So in terms of politics, so this might be interesting to your listeners. So Israelis they're quite sort of hawkish politically, which means like when it comes to foreign policy, their relationship with their Arab neighbors, they tend to be very conservative. But overall, on issues like LGBTQ rights and abortion, they're extremely left-wing, much more than most Americans. So Israel is I think it's the abortion capital in the world because abortion, even for Orthodox Jews, actually, even for the most religious Jews, the Talmud, which is our code of law, says that, life begins at 40 days. So it doesn't really begin at conception. So it doesn't quite map onto the Christian view. So the Israeli community is in some ways conservative, in some ways liberal, but then the American Jewish community is very liberal in its majority. So 75% of American Jews are Democrats.
Yeah.
Then you have the 25% who are Republicans, and then a lot of Orthodox Jews are increasingly becoming more and more aligned with the Republican Party over issues of religious liberty that I'm sure you guys are very familiar with.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Wow. So I got to know you through some mutual friends, which we're going to talk about in a second. Mm-hmm. And the first thing that I did was follow you on Twitter. So that was I'm going to find her and I'm going to follow her on Twitter. I have found following you incredibly refreshing. As a journalist, as an opinion editor, I think you would probably call yourself a liberal, right? And a Jewish person. Your tone on Twitter and your tone in other arenas that I've heard you in is just really, really refreshing. I listened to you on the Genuinely Interested podcast just the other day. Can you maybe sort of walk us a little bit on how you got here? Because whether it's true or not, our observation as Americans is that the media is divided, our society is divided, that you're really not going to get the facts from I shouldn't say a mainstream because that would categorize it, from a major media outlet. You're not going to get the truth. You're going to get the spin from one side or the other. Mm-hmm. How did you wind up in this position of being kind of a voice of truth and a voice of reason as an opinion editor?
Well, I thank you so much. I really appreciate that characterization. I started off, I would say, very much in that media academic bubble. In some ways, I've gotten more far left on certain economic questions, but so has the Republican Party. But in a lot of ways, I've come to be much more suspicious of the sort of reigning orthodoxies of the day. How that happened, it happened because of two major things that happened. The first was I realized that Americans are just not as divided as everybody is telling us they are, and I couldn't understand why that was. So, for example, I started to notice how many Republicans were sort of at the forefront of criminal justice reform.
Yeah.
And I was like, why is no one talking about this? Like, why aren't Democrats jumping up and down and making coalitions with them and pushing? And a little bit that's happening, but it's very much on the sidelines,
Yeah.
And then you saw, so President Trump passed the First Step Act. He's responsible for freeing about 4,000 Black men from prison. And they were put there by Joe Biden, by the crime bill, right?
The crime bill in 94, that's right.
Exactly. Yeah. How is no one talking about this? Like every article in the New York Times about the First Step Act, the headline is so snarky. It's always undercutting. So I started to notice that stuff. And then I started, noticing this sort of rising anti-Semitism, which I do think actually happened a large part because of the president's really gross language. I think he is overblamed for a lot of things and underpraised for a lot of things, for a lot of very progressive things. But I think that the rhetoric, the ugliness of the rhetoric that a lot of people I know sort of looked beyond because of abortion, for example, and I respect that. I understand why somebody would do that, but that sort of ugly rhetoric, it brought out anti-Semitism, not just on the far right, but on the far left as well.
Yeah.
And that really made me feel like I was not aligned with that side. I mean, it was just so scary. Like, for example, there was a congresswoman who tweeted something anti-Semitic that I thought was anti-Semitic.
Right.
And I sort of called her out. And the backlash I faced for saying, hey, please don't talk about Jews that way.
Right,
it's really dangerous.
Right.
The insane backlash I faced from friends, from writers, from people whose careers I had helped, who wrote for me. It was really shocking. And so that was very much a wake-up call. So those two things together, I think Trump really scrambled the right-left divide on the economic front, and seeing how the media was so unable to honestly assess what he was doing, which is such a shame, because he would sell his daughter for somebody to say something nice about him on cable news, you could get anything out of this person. Yeah. They could have gotten so much out of him, but instead they sort of pursued this impeachment stuff, and the media. I mean, I'm going on, and I want to stop talking so much, but I think there's a big class element too, and if that's interesting, I can go more into that further on. But I think increasingly I'm starting to see and believe that the main dividing line in America is actually class. It has a lot to do with college, and the Democrats are increasingly the party of the college educated.
Right.
And I think that for college educated people like me, we look at Trump and he's so crass and but that's about taste, And we acted like it was about morality. We acted like he was evil, and they called him a Nazi and a racist. And but the things that they were actually objecting to were really much more about class. And I think that that's sort of the major undercovered story of the last 4 years.
Well, it's just, at least for me personally, it's comforting to know that, because a free press and objective journalism is really important, I think, to a civilized society. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's scary out there on Twitter, Dan. I don't know if you're on Twitter, but it's scary. Like Batya said, it can get nasty, not over the facts, just over opinion and rhetoric and outrage and stuff. So Batya, you've been representing the Jewish people and ensuring, fighting against anti-Semitism. Before we kind of continue that conversation a little bit, Dan, have you ever been to a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah?
I have not.
You have
actually, not? No, I have not. Have you?
I have. Batya, it's where I had my first glass of wine.
Wow.
And I'm not going to say at what age it was, Dan. But what is it when it's the girl?
Bat mitzvah.
A bat mitzvah. So that was my first one. Shout out to my friend Melanie Pass from Louisville, Kentucky. It was really fun, Dan.
Yeah,
it was
it
really
sounds like
fun,
fun.
I have to say.
I always associate like bar mitzvahs and stuff with like the Adam Sandler movies. Those were like the first times I saw like as a kid, like represented.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
So this podcast is about Good Samaritans. Is that controversial to people of Jewish faith? Like, how would that go over?
So that's a really interesting question. I have heard somebody say that because the Good Samaritan is compared to Jews who did not help, that has sort of an anti-Semitic tone. But I don't think a lot of people think that. I don't think that.
Yeah.
I will tell you what the most controversial aspect.
This is it. She's going to dox us, Dan, right here with the Walking Through Samaria podcast. Here it comes. I'm sorry, Batya. Please continue.
No, actually, I actually want to tell you a story before that. Which is that I was at a conference and I was protested by a group of. It was at a university, and a group of students showed up to protest me and the other Jewish speakers. It was horrific.
Oh gosh!
And it was really horrifying. And nobody stood up for us. Like nobody was like, "Hey!" It was a conference on racism and anti-Semitism, and these kids were having this anti-Semitic protest against us. And not one of the professors said anything. It was horrible. And I got back to my hotel and I heard these. I got into the elevator and I was so sad and depressed. And there was a group of Christians in the elevator, and they were there for a different conference, and they were talking, and they had these sort of thick Southern accents. And I remember just thinking to myself, like, I know that any one of these people is less anti-Semitic than every single person at this conference.
Oh my gosh!
And I just
crazy?
my heart went out. It was just like, why am I not at that conference?
Aww.
It was so visceral and powerful. And I think that there is a lot of philo-Semitism, like the love of Jews, like in the community, especially the love of Israel. Like when you talk to Christians, it really does come across. The one thing that Jews get sensitive about, if I can say that, is it interesting? I mean, I'm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. Yes, please.
Okay. So I wouldn't say it's the Good Samaritan thing. Jews sometimes have a problem with the kind of end of days narrative where people either become Christian or burn, because to Jews, they hear that and they say, why doesn't your fantasy of the end of days include people who remain Jews? And I think the answer that Christians have told me is that, well, we think we have this amazing thing and we want everyone else to have it. But I think because of the Jewish history of forced conversion, sometimes that is a thing that sort of can be triggering to the Jewish community, especially people who are more sort of in the liberal camp. Yeah. Like, why doesn't your end of days vision have us as ourselves in it? Why is it like a fantasy that has only Christians and no Jews anymore? I would say that is sort of the most controversial piece, I think.
Gotcha.
Much more than the Good Samaritans.
Well, I appreciate you bringing it up, Batya, because these are sort of the conversations that we love to have, right? Which is, we have much more in common than probably not, but there's certain things that get said that can create, chasms. For what it's worth, the way we talk about the parable in Luke chapter 10 of the Good Samaritan is when you research the history in 1 Kings and other books in the Old Testament, Jews and Samaritans actually had much more in common than they didn't, right? And it was the separation of the northern and the southern kingdom, the north being conquered by the Assyrians, the southern kingdom being conquered by the Babylonians, some arguments over temples and idols and little things. They were all Jewish people. Right. And so I think, for Dan and I and for the posture of this podcast, it is really using the parable of the Good Samaritan to get people talking about really to resemble the hero of that story, these divisions that society or people or denominations or whatever have tried to create. Really, that parable is telling us those shouldn't exist.
That's so beautiful.
That's the story. Anyway. So you don't have to dox us just yet. Well, I want to talk about this Aspen thing. Have you ever been to Aspen, Dan?
No. Want to, though.
An awesome place. Do you get to go, Batya? Do you get to go to Aspen?
I think that there's 5 leadership trainings over the 3 years of the fellowship. And I think one of them is in Aspen. Yeah.
It's a great place. So let me set this up. So political division is, I think, something that's been challenging for people of faith. It's obviously been challenging for the country. It's challenging for relationships. And again, Batya, I just want to compliment you for sort of diving into that really messy place where you're trying to be a voice of truth and reason amongst really most people that seem like they want to be on one side or the other. It was just recently that I found out there's a common sense caucus in the Senate. I never knew such a thing existed. I think Senator Collins from Maine is actually kind of the head of the caucus, whatever that might mean. Common Sense Coalition, it's sometimes referred to. And then I heard about your fellowship nomination. I think I may have read about it on Twitter. Tell us about the Civil Society Fellowship, and congratulations, by the way. What kind of work are you going to be doing? What do those 3 years look like?
Thank you so much. I'm not really sure. I don't have a lot of details right now. I think it's part of the aim is to create a community and a support system for people who are engaged in civil discourse. I feel really humbled to have been chosen, but I also am really grateful because so I'm the opinion editor of The Forward. What that means is that my job is to represent the full breadth of opinion of the Jewish community and for the Jewish community, which means that I'm running people who love Trump all the time. But nobody else is doing that anymore. You know, the New York Times has sort of given up on that, right? There was that big brouhaha over the Tom Cotton op-ed.
Right.
In the last 6 months, they haven't run a single op-ed by somebody who supports the president, which I think is insanity. Like, you're supposed to be the paper of record, and you have essentially deplatformed 70 million Americans. Like, it's so dangerous.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I get so much blowback for doing this. And it feels really lonely because I think a lot of people are just too scared of like the online mob to be like, I need to know how these people think. Like, it's not just, first of all, I have a burning curiosity to understand them. You know, and second of all, like, I have a burning desire to accurately reflect America as it is and to be able to see what's actually happening. And like you said, you read a lot of the mainstream media and you just cannot get a sense of what is actually happening out there in our nation. And, you know, like I said, I think we're so much less polarized than we think. Like, even I'll give you an example, abortion, right? Like, it looks like 50% of Americans, 49% of Americans say they're pro-life and 49% say they're pro-choice, right? It seems obvious, totally polarized, right? But if you drill down, so 60% of people who are pro-choice, right? 60% only think it should be legal in the first trimester. And something like 95% of people who say that they are pro-life think there should be exceptions for rape, incest, deformity, and the mother's health. So what does that tell you? There's 80% agreement on 80% of the issues.
Right.
You would never know that to listen to the politicians or to read our newspapers.
Isn't that crazy?
Right? What do the politicians do? The Democrats are like, we're going to be the party of you can have an abortion until the day before the baby is due. And what do the Republicans do? They say, oh, we're going to put you in jail if you have an abortion after 6 weeks. It's insanity. Like, nobody's representing the huge consensus in our nation. Sorry, I got off topic.
No, it's so good, and we'll go back to the fellowship in a second. But I want to give you one more data point, and you may know this. Dan and I have talked a lot about this on the podcast. I don't think this is necessarily the majority, but the Evangelical Immigration Forum, which Giving Company has signed on to, World Vision has signed on to, Compassion has signed on to, World Relief has signed on to, a whole host of organizations proposed a 6-point kind of solution to the immigration challenges in this country. And it included, I'm not going to get all 6 probably off the top of my head, but it included a path to legal status, protecting the integrity of the family, securing the border, like 6 what seem to be really rational things that neither political party would ever touch, right? All on their own. And we sit there and we go, first of all, I was just pleased that it came from evangelicals, because evangelicals sometimes don't get the greatest reputation in the topic of immigration and refugees, which is unfortunate. But here it is. This, I mean, the movers and shakers in the evangelical community proposed this platform. There's not one piece of legislation that has been introduced since the proposal of that platform that meets those criteria. And you would think that the country is, never going to have like a Venn diagram overlapping these positions, when the reality is probably most people do.
Totally. But I would say, like, to your listeners, like, you guys have your party, you have them hostage. Like, there's 80 million of you. You could get them to do whatever you want. I just feel like you have such a huge influence and such a huge ability to impact what this nation looks like. And I say that as someone who, like, honestly, I respect your vote for the president. I'm not one of these people who's like, anyone who voted for him is a racist. I think that's disgusting and false. I can think of 5 very good, very justifiable reasons for voting for him. But I think that the evangelical community has not quite realized the potential and the power that you have to make this country a more compassionate place on so many fronts.
Yeah. Well, that's shout out all of our listeners. I hope you're listening to Batya's wisdom here, because that's very well said. And I certainly don't want to speak for all our listeners, and I know I don't speak for all evangelicals. But compassion needs to be kind of what we lead with, right? Compassion and love. That really is the gospel message. And
especially now, because, like, you've basically taken over the Supreme Court. So it's like, they can't even offer you that anymore. You know what I'm saying? First of all, I really, really admire Amy Coney Barrett. I think she is.
I do as well.
I'm
very glad she's there.
Yep. Like the feminist ideal, like that. She's so smarter than any man in any room.
I agree.
The grace that she brings to her life, those adopted kids, I mean, everything. She's so admirable. But what I'm saying is like, you guys, you own the court now. Like, nobody can offer you anything on that front. Like, you can use your whole vote to get anything else that you want at this point.
Well, I think most people of faith, again, I don't pretend to speak for the evangelical community, and I think some people who know my political positions wouldn't necessarily consider me an evangelical, but I think the planet, taking care of the planet and sort of honoring and respecting immigrants and refugees, like those two things have to be core to our faith. If you can sort of get rid of the political noise, I think that any person of faith would say, how can you not be for those two things?
It's funny you should bring up those two things, because I feel like, to me, those two things are very much like, when I think about them from a class point of view, like, I feel like the working class is always asked to bear the brunt of all of these environmental policies, and meanwhile you have like elites getting on private jets,
right,
and like going to their conferences. But then it's always like, oh, let's ban fracking. It's always like the working class who's being asked to bear the brunt of those policies. And on immigration as well, I feel a lot like that there's been this kind of, until Trump, there has been a kind of bipartisan free market, open borders, not like unspoken, but very much like a Kochian relationship to immigration that has actually harmed the working class, the global markets, outsourcing all these working class jobs to China. And so I feel like, in a way, if Trump hadn't been so abrasive and spoken in such an ugly manner, like, there is like a working class argument to be made. I mean, Bernie Sanders used to make this argument. He used to say, like, no, we can't have people coming in here and working for $2-3 an hour. Like, he's like, that's what the Koch brothers want. That's what the Republicans want. And it's so, to me, those two issues specifically, I feel like, I would a working class or a pro-labor politics that's really invested in bestowing dignity upon every human being who is under our purview, wouldn't necessarily have to be sort of so liberal on those two issues. But I completely agree with you that, the question is dignity and compassion, and how do we treat the vulnerable, the people whose lives are intersecting with ours, who have less than us. And
that's it.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what the evangelical community can bring to our nation.
That's good. We're going to take your comments as a call to action, as encouragement that we need to do better. Let's go back to Aspen for a second. What do you hope comes from your time in the fellowship? What would you hope the results would be?
I was just on a call before this from the previous cohort, and they were each interviewing a friend who they felt brought something to the table. And the first woman who was interviewed was the head of the George Bush, I forget what it's called, institute or something in Texas. And she was just talking about compassionate conservatism. And I was just like, where else are liberals and conservatives coming together to have that conversation? I was like, I got misty-eyed because I was just so blessed. I felt so blessed to be part of just this diverse group. And I very much feel that we're being asked very much, by the liberal media to believe that you have to choose between racial diversity and ideological diversity. And I totally reject that. And you can have both. I'm sure you guys know this because evangelical communities are often places where you have, a lot of racial diversity.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I'm really hoping to learn from people who are engaged in this work across the nation, people who are in their little pockets and their little communities, doing the work of bringing this nation together and I would say dispelling the illusion that we are actually polarized. We're not. Our politicians are polarized because they get power out of being polarized.
That's exactly right.
The media is polarized because it gets money out of being polarized. Yep. But Americans are not. Americans agree on so many issues, so I gave you the abortion example, 80% agreement on 80% of the issues. We agree about gun control. Like everybody wants the same thing, like sensible gun ownership. If you look at, there's like 90% support for like people want to have guns and they also want background checks. It's like totally obvious things. And instead of like actually just supporting what the people want, you have these crazy, like the NRA on the one hand and then the Democrats on the other. And like nobody's representing where people are at.
That's so well said.
Yeah.
So Dan, I'm going to put you on the spot.
Put me on the spot.
Because I sort of made an assumption about Batya's politics, which we're going to clarify in a second.
Oh, goodness.
What would you call yourself?
I don't feel identified in any party at all.
But would you call yourself liberal, conservative, independent? Like, forget about the parties.
Probably independent. I've taken a couple of the surveys online to see which party you align with.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's pretty it sways one way, but very small. You know what I mean? Yeah. Very small. Like it I could go either way. I'm the person that they're campaigning for because you can convince me.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like I'm the same way.
Yeah.
So Batya, if somebody were to say opinion editor, Brooklyn, New York, PhD from Berkeley, University of Chicago, Jewish, they'd probably say you were a liberal.
Okay.
Is that right?
So it's hard. On the economic front, I'm a socialist. I can say that. I think that the government should be invested much more heavily in ensuring the dignity of every human being. And I think that people don't want handouts. They want jobs. Like they want the dignity that comes from having a job. And I think that, the government should be much more involved in labor unions and making sure that people have dignified work. Like actually one of Trump's major achievements was he renegotiated NAFTA, which was an agreement that allowed for car parts and cars car parts to come in from, different countries with zero tariffs, which meant that all of these factories were shipped out to Mexico, and about 500,000 American jobs were lost, right? So Trump renegotiated that in such a way that really revitalized the auto industry.
Right.
Never read about that. And the reason you didn't read about it was because the Republicans hated it because it was interventionist and they love zero tariffs and they love free trade. And the Democrats couldn't talk about it because even though some progressives are, like this kind of thing, they can't say anything nice about Trump.
And
so
it was pro-labor.
No one wrote about it.
Yeah, it was pro-labor. pro-labor. Yeah.
Totally pro-labor. It was the most pro-labor agreement the United States had ever signed. So here I am praising it to high heavens. I think it was a really incredible thing to do. And I would like to see a lot more of that. So I am a socialist, but all of the politicians who agree with me on that stuff on the left, they have a problem with Jews. And I don't know why. It's like a huge problem. Every time you hear some politicians speaking in a way that I identify with on the economic front, at some point they bring some friend onto the stage with them, and that friend has said that Jews caused 9/11, or that, you know what I mean? It's like there's always and I really struggle to understand why that is, but it's really sad. So I am left, but with a huge caveat that I can't really quite identify with that aspect of the left, and also this wokeness, this kind of the terrorizing of people who dissent. So the liberals, I feel like they're very free market oriented on the economic front, and I hate that stuff. But on the other hand, they do, still sort of, pay lip service to centrism and bipartisanship and negotiating with the other side. And I'm very much pro that. I will say that my views on abortion have changed very much recently in the direction of the right. Like I used to be much more liberal on that, and I find myself getting more conservative as I get older. I don't really know why.
Well, it's interesting, and I only bring it up because it's one of those paradoxes again where all we've heard about over the last, since February, so what is that, 2 to 11, 9 months, is that conservatives are not pro-science, right?
Right.
So we're ignoring science. That's what we're doing. And Dan has his mask on and I don't. So that's probably, if you can get a picture of what's going on here. Anyway, the science is leading us in a direction of probably being more sensitive to the fetus in the womb, right? Like we're learning more, and we've got 4D 100%. Ultrasound, and like you said, I think most people are super uncomfortable with thinking of anything past the first trimester. Yeah. I know probably most of our listeners, myself included, are very much pro-life, and so you sit there and you go, well, wait, you can't say we're not pro-science on one side and that we are on the other. Like it's just so crazy when it becomes political, because you lose the objectivity, you lose the ability to sort of tackle each issue in its individuality.
Yeah, but I also think that whole narrative of the conservatives being like anti-science is just so ridiculous. Like who told us not to wear masks for the first 2 months of the pandemic? Who lied and said that they were not effective so they could stockpile them for essential workers, and then turned around and said, wear a mask? That was like Dr. Fauci and the CDC. It's like if we were following them, like we would have, the messaging has been so contradictory. Or like when the CDC came out and said they support the Black Lives Matter protests in the midst of the pandemic because racism kills. Like, come on, like you can't ask people to then take you seriously as some objective player when you're clearly invested in a political fight. You know what I mean?
That's right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's it. That's it. It's too bad. I don't know where we lost our objectivity in the political spectrum or in the media. It just seems, I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I have a whole theory about that if it's interesting, but I don't know if that's like of interest to your listeners.
Well, let's talk about welded for a little bit, and then we can come back to it if we have some time, because I just, it's so much fun to hear Batya talk, because it's just not what you read. It's not what you see on Twitter. It's not what you hear on cable news. It's just refreshing. And I've tried every once in a while, Batya, just as an aside, to every once in a while on social media, I'll inappropriately kind of lean into somebody's post or tweet and go, oh, really? Did you think about this? Or did you think about that? And it never goes well. Like people get really sensitive when you bring up the facts and the perspectives. I'll give you one final example and then we can move on, because this will lead us to the welded discussion. The two Republicans that got called racist over the vote recount in Michigan. Mm-hmm. And the gentleman who, I forget his role, but he got on the Zoom call and said, you two are racist, right? And I wanted to go, well, did you vote for Gary Peters or did you vote for John James? And because Gary Peters is sort of your older Caucasian, career politician, and he's the Democrat.
Right.
John James is your heroic Navy veteran, African-American young guy, right? And anyway, the narratives always break down. the biases always get lost once you start to dive into the facts, which it seems like you do really, really well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel conflicted about it because on the one hand, I agree with you. Like everything gets called racist these days. That is just something you disagree with, and it's so effective because of the horror we feel at being called a racist. But the fact that we feel so horrified at being called that is the proof that like this isn't like, it's not your grandmother's South anymore. Like there's been a huge seismic shift around these issues. So like, yeah, it's true that like there have been systematic efforts to take away Black people's votes. That's true. Like that is in our history and we have to deal with that. It's even true, I would say, that some Republicans are still trying to redistrict areas to, have a greater share of influence in those areas. But to ignore the huge progress that has been made in this nation on the racial front, I think is just, it's so wrong and it's so evil. And it compares the actual horrors of the past to much smaller things that are happening today in a way that really erases the horror of what once was. And I'm really opposed to that.
Well, let's get into it. So to our listeners, you're probably sitting here going, the Walking Through Samaria, one of the co-hosts is an older, Christian conservative capitalist, and he's talking to Batya, who's younger and Jewish and an opinion editor and a PhD from Berkeley and has a different view of economics and the government role in economics. And yet I feel, Batya, and this is the whole point of this podcast, like you and I have so much in common. Mm-hmm. Our desire to look at the facts and to look at reason and to be able to debate and or discuss the issues and to not make our political alignment the defining factor over, what our position's going to be. Mm-hmm. And anyway, because I really want to talk about Welded. Batya, you and I have mutual friends in North Carolina who are named Pastor Jay Stewart and Pastor Derek Hawkins. They're the ones who actually mentioned your name to me, and I immediately read your piece in the New York Review because we released a book just this week. So it's awesome that you came on our podcast this week. The book is written by Pastor Derek Hawkins and Pastor Jay Stewart called Welded, Forming Racial Bonds That Last. It's about the merger of kind of a large, predominantly white megachurch in the suburbs of Charlotte with a Black church near Greensboro. And I am dying to know, how in the world did you get your hands on this story? And well, we'll talk about the impact of that, but please tell our listeners how you got to know Pastor Stewart and Pastor Hawkins.
It's very funny. I was at the time trying to write and sell a book about how we're a lot less divided than we think. And how Americans are really quite united. I could not get anybody to buy that book because it was, I guess, not the message that people wanted to read. I am now working on a book about why the media became the way it is, how it got sort of co-opted by this sort of very academic, woke narrative.
Dan and I will buy both of them, Batya. We got 2 copies guaranteed of each. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Thank you so much. So, the failed book, I was researching unity in America, and I was looking at sort of churches that were sort of integrating racially. And this idea, especially sort of in the age of Trump, of putting, I think Pastor Derek says, sort of, we're not black and white, we're all covered in the blood of Christ, is how he put it. The sort of this idea that there's something higher than that. And I think that there's a real message for America in that. So Pastor Derek recently wrote a piece for me at the forward about what he's learned about unity from being in a multiracial church at a time when the Black community was very much on the Democratic side and the white evangelical community very much on the President Trump side, and just how to have a sort of a higher value than politics, which is something that I think a lot of Americans, especially liberals, have lost because they're not religious anymore. And what happens when you're not religious is, well, when you are religious, there's just a higher thing. It's not always about you and your ego and your beliefs. Like you have to at some point have, you sort of are humbled before something bigger than you, something older than you, something more important than just your own ego and your own feeling from moment to moment. So I was researching, biracial or multiracial churches, and I came across Pastor Derek and Pastor Jay's amazing story. And I just had to meet them. I just felt like I was very moved, and I was very emotional when I was reading about them. And then I went to meet them, and I was very emotional. And
that's awesome.
While I was there.
Well, for our listeners, we did release the book this week. It's called Welded, Forming Racial Bonds That Last, from Pastor Derek Hawkins and Pastor Jay Stewart. The foreword's written by Sam Collier. He's starting Hillsong Church in Atlanta in the month of January. I want to maybe probe a little bit more into your experience at the church. Mm-hmm. So the story on the New York Review is actually fantastic. To our listeners, just to fill you in, if you don't know the story yet, we did have Pastor Hawkins and Pastor Stewart on the podcast a few weeks ago, but right before the Charlotte race riots in 2016, where Keith Scott was killed by a police officer, they had decided to merge their churches. And I think 2 days later, Keith Lamont Scott is killed, and the riots happen in Charlotte, and they have to sort of immediately deal with the reality of what they're trying to do. And I know this is probably oversimplifying it, but my understanding is that by and large, both churches really supported the move of coming together. And not that it was without challenge. I'm sure there were challenges. I'm sure there were people that left the church on both sides, which is super unfortunate. But it was, the evangelical church needs a few wins like this, because I think you even wrote in your story that Dr. Martin Luther King said that Sunday was the most segregated hour. Sunday morning was the most segregated hour in the country, which is really too bad. What did you observe or find out about the spirit of these two churches, separate and then together?
I think, you walk into both churches, and I don't know if every church is like this. I haven't been to that many in my life, I'll be honest, but there is a feeling that like the presence of God is here. Like it's just very clear that this is what God wants. I don't know how else to put it. Like that these are holy men, and that they have been called to do God's work. And I think you really feel that they are putting aside their own egos in order to do something that's hard. It's not easy. Like, it's I think it's probably very rewarding for them, but it's hard. I mean, I spoke to Pastor Derek a lot about this political divide. I mean, it is people take politics personally. And he said to me at one point, I think if I allow a president to come between me and unity with a person, that shows a lack of maturity.
Lack of maturity. Yeah. That's right. What a great thing.
It was just the most incredible thing I had ever, it was just so deep and so simple, but to get to that place, I think requires a huge person, like a really, really big person. And you just feel the insane humility that both Pastor Derek and Pastor Jay have, and their kindness and their integrity. And, they're both like so smart. And it was just really a really special experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I kind of want to put you on the spot, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You were called up to the altar of the church in Charlotte, and the team at Refuge prayed for you, and you wrote that you broke down in tears. Could you tell us a little bit more about that experience?
Yeah, it was really powerful. So first of all, because I'm observant, so the synagogues that I grew up praying in, now it's more ambivalent, but I grew up praying in synagogues where women were behind a partition. So women in the Orthodox stream, women aren't allowed to participate. They have to stand behind a curtain or just on it, very separated off. So first of all, just seeing the female leadership was already like very intense. I think also I think Americans so want a racial healing. Like, I think Americans of all colors were so desperate for that. And I know that I feel that very much, like that this is urgent. And so to be in a space that is sort of addressing that was really, really powerful. And then to have them pray on me and to sort of to recognize in me that I'm sort of trying to do the same thing was really powerful. And at some point it was just like I was surrounded by all these people and I could really just feel like, the presence of God and also just like the love that was coming from this community towards all of its members. It was really powerful.
That's good. Well, I obviously want our listeners to buy the book because we're the publisher, but I would also encourage our listeners to read your story on the New York Review. I think it was called A Tale of Two Churches. Is that right? The name of the story? And Batya, again, I hope you don't feel like I'm sucking up to you all the time, but I mean, your honesty and your transparency in that review, in that story was just incredible. For someone to say what you felt and what you experienced at a Christian church. I want to touch on one more, if you don't mind, which was you took the time because you were down in North Carolina to walk through the International Civil Rights Center and Museum, which was built around the Woolworths, which was the story of the Greensboro Four back in the 60s. And, as another sort of political nuance, Dwight Eisenhower was in the office at the time. He's a Republican, and he's like, "Hey, like, I'm for these four people, right? Like I think these four people should experience equality at the lunch counter at the Woolworths." So, anyway, and it was interesting reading your story and then researching the Greensboro Four a little bit more, like how that went down. It was very courageous. And it grew, the movement grew. And then you read the story of the older white woman coming by and saying, "You're so courageous. I wish you would have done this weeks ago or months ago." And of course, there were lots of bad reactions as well. I don't want to make it seem like it was different than it was. But do you mind? You talked about your experience being up on stage at the altar at Refuge Church. What did it mean for you to go through that museum and what learnings can we pull out of you from that?
Yeah, I was very emotional.
I'll bet. Yeah.
The whole 3 days was I cried a lot. I mean, just walking the tour, and I was just standing there on the tour. We get to this photo of Emmett Till, and I'm just like weeping, and everyone just like pull it together, I think it's really important, especially for someone like me who's sort of a little bit suspicious of the language of that, that America is still a white supremacy, or that we're still living in, this unabated, state of like systemic racism. For someone like me to truly face the past. And it's very hard because I love this country so much. But the things that we did in our past are so terrible. To get an accurate assessment of which of those things we're still doing and which of those things we're not doing, by truly acknowledging and sitting with the pain of what we have done. And I think it's really important to do that. And actually, this might be interesting to you, but I think a lot about like the Germans and what they did after the Holocaust. And people talk a lot about why we haven't done a similar thing in America, where they really did sort of acknowledge what they had done. They set up everywhere, reminders of the horror that had happened to move on. And but what happened in Germany was their collective guilt was used to unify them. Whereas what I feel like happened in America was, because there was the North and the South, all of the guilt of racism was put on the South because of slavery. And the North, which had been equally racist and continued to be equally racist, let itself off scot-free. And so that kind of original sin was used to not to unify, but to divide us. And, when I look now, for example, at New York City, so New York City's public schools are more segregated than Alabama's.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
I mean, you would never know it from the way the people in the New York Times are sitting there telling you all in the South that you're like the biggest racists. And meanwhile, they won't send their children to school, to public schools, or they'll only send them they have elite public schools. Have you ever heard of such a thing? New York has elite public schools. There's 3 public schools that are like incredible, where you go straight to Harvard, and the rest are trash. Like, who ever heard of such a thing? Like, so to me, it's like, how do we find a way to move on in a way that unifies us, as opposed to dividing us? And I think that that's what Dr. King really represented. And you've really lost that. So Dr. King would say to white protesters or white people who he wanted to join his movement, he would say, "You're better than this. You're better than this racist behavior. I know you. You're a Christian. You're better than this." And today, what do you see? Like in the protesters, they're always telling us, "You're terrible. You're racist. You don't think you're racist, but you are. This country is terrible." You know what I mean? It's the opposite message.
Oh,
and
wow.
I hate that kind of that divisiveness. Let us all raise up together. Everybody wants the same thing. I truly believe that was not always the case. But, especially after George Floyd's murder, like, when did you think you were going to hear Lindsey Graham saying that, Black men are brutalized by the police? He said it. He believes it. Mitch McConnell is out here saying our original sin is not too far. We have to remember, like, you would never have thought that you would hear them saying these things 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but they're saying it now. So why are we not unifying around that? Why is it used only to further divide us?
It's so well said. I want to give one more example, because for our listeners, if any of you are on Twitter and you want a refreshing experience, you got to follow Batya, and I'll let you tell them how to do that in a second, Batya. But I'm gonna give an example on either side, and I'll go ahead and use the names just so that everybody knows what I'm talking about. But my intention is never to, like you said, I don't want to indict anybody. I don't want to judge anybody. I just want to observe. And for people of faith, if you dive into the parable of the Good Samaritan and what it really is intended to say, it is, we have much more in common than we think. We should not let a road separate us. And we are called to love our neighbor without a descriptor in front of the word neighbor. And Jesus was fairly radical in where he said we're called to love our enemies. And Christians online, in my opinion, are not doing any better at being less outraged or less mean or whatever on at least on Twitter. Maybe they're better on Instagram, because that's a nicer platform. But you actually called somebody out on Twitter, which I was supportive of, and I like all these people, so I'm just gonna mention it. But I saw on Twitter how John Pavlovitz, who's sort of considered to be the lefty Christian guy, kind of go after Dan Crenshaw on Twitter in a way that was just really not appropriate for a person of faith. And then you called out Marco Rubio, who is considered to be a person of faith, for going after the Reverend Warnock, who's one of the Senate candidates here in Georgia, which it's going to get crazy here in Georgia over the next month and a half. I mean, it's going to get crazy. And he's the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, right? Dr. Martin Luther King's old church. And granted, all 4 of them are politicians now. And so I personally feel that when you decide to become a politician, you sort of lose some of your purity, if you will. I don't know if that's necessarily the right term. But what you said on Twitter was, hey, the way Democrats went after Amy Coney Barrett was inappropriate and disgusting. And why can't you call it out when it's coming from the other side as well? That, to me, is Good Samaritan stuff, right? Like, love your neighbor, love your enemy, be a person of dignity, talk with dignity and grace when you're online or when you're in person. How did it get to be so nasty online? I mean, is this partially Trump's fault? Like, where did all this come from? And could you maybe tell our listeners how to be better and not so aligned with the age of outrage, as Ed Stetzer called it, when they're online?
You know, it's very hard because outrage it makes us feel righteous. And so it's very hard. You know, when Marco Rubio tweeted that, I'm sure part of him was like truly offended by what the Reverend had said. And it's so easy to indulge that, but also the platforms themselves really reward like extreme emotion, especially when it's negative, so extreme anger. Like that, I could write right now. I could write 5 tweets that would get 10,000 retweets in 5 minutes. Right? It's like I know exactly what the algorithm is looking for. I know what everybody on Twitter is looking for. They want to be enraged. And so, you know, we're addicted to the attention. We go to these platforms to get attention. And the way you get attention is by sort of feeding these outrage machines and getting more and more crazy, which is sort of what's happened very much in the media. And it is, I'll give you an example. It's like constant labor. So the other day, this was in the beginning of the pandemic. A friend of mine tweeted something and it got so much outrage and it went, totally viral. Like everybody was retweeting it with their commentary, whatever. And I tweeted, I just cannot understand why some people want to be the 5,000th person to dunk on something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Literally 10 minutes later, someone who I don't like tweeted something and I literally was halfway through composing a tweet dunking on him before I was like, girl, what you doing? Like, what is this? Like, I was literally doing this because you feel righteous, you feel like you are. It's very hard to remember, like, well, what is God's work right now? Like, is it really to dunk on this person on this website on my computer? Like, is that really the thing I'm supposed to be doing? And I think I just try really hard to like never tweet in anger. Never tweet, like just because also as an editor, it's like, you can't convince anybody when you're angry. Like it's because nobody can get into your body. And anger is such a physical emotion. Like you're only going to be talking to the people who already agree with you. And there's really no point in that because they already agree with you. You have to picture the person who is like, kind of like, honest but skeptical of your worldview. It's for me. I think a lot of it is about credibility because I'm in the convincing business. That's what the opinion business is supposed to be. It's convincing people who disagree with us, and the only way to do that is to always picture them in the most generous light and be out there trying to change their mind, and instead of just like playing to your choir.
That's great.
That was awesome.
That's great. Well, Batya, as we start to wrap up, this is just such a refreshing, encouraging, enlightening conversation. I'm sure our listeners are going to want to understand, like, where can they find your stuff? How do they follow you online? Where are your articles written? Like, how can they soak up more of your content?
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this too. It's just really nice to talk to people who are coming like in good faith. It's very rare, and I truly appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you so much.
First of all, they can email me. I'm always happy to get emails. My email is Batya, Batya @forward.com. That's it. Email me. Just talk to me. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is and then B, and then my last name, Ungar-Sargon. So it's @Ungar-Sargon. And you can follow the Forward. You can subscribe to the Forward. And I try to write, a couple times a month. So you can see my writings there. My most recent pieces one was an interview with a Black, deaf, Jewish filmmaker who made a film about questioning the liberal narrative around Michael Brown's murder. And then I wrote a piece called 5 Progressive Trump Achievements.
Oh my gosh, you are really in the thick of it. Like you are in the war zone.
Listen, that's the job, and that's why it's so difficult because I think very few people still think that this is the job, is to like call it like you see it, and so it's very lonely out there.
Well, that is awesome. I am sure you are going to have more followers after our listeners hear this podcast. At the risk of sounding preachy, I just want to remind our listeners what they've heard from Batya, and just to have a little fun, Batya, if you don't mind, as I lead up to this. I think you were born in Boston, is that right?
I was actually born in Philly. I moved to Boston when I was 3.
Okay. So born in Philly, moved to Boston when you were young, then went to Israel, then to the University of Chicago, then a PhD at Berkeley, and I think you said you finished up your thesis in New York, if I remember correctly, or at least did some research there of the Jewish faith. An opinion editor. I know I keep saying that. It's not intended to be an insult. I'm sort of being stereotypical. Why
does it sound like an insult when you say
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But here's what I'm trying to say. You have taught us, you have said to us to use grace and to remember that the people we are engaging with, whether or not they agree with us religiously, politically, socially, whatever, they are image bearers. We are all equally made in the image of God. We are all equally loved by God. And I share that with you. And the world would tell you and I, Batya, which is, again, my apologies for using your work title against you, because that's not the intention. But the society would sort of tell us that you and I should have nothing in common, right? And the reality is we have everything in common. We are image bearers. We are equally loved by God. We have these great friends in Derek Hawkins and Jay Stewart. We have both stood up on that stage. I was on that stage Tuesday night, choking up, just like you did.
Yeah.
Because of what I was experiencing and the fact that I felt that this book and this story needed to be told. And you told it a year before we told it. You know, your story came out in the New York Review in November of 2019, and our book came out in November of 2020. And so now we have everything in common. And that's what I just want to remind our listeners that is at the heart of the parable of the Good Samaritan, and is at the heart of this conversation. And so we're just so appreciative, Batya, of your perspective. And gosh, it has got to be tough. I mean, I just think about the online environment and the media environment, and you are like, hey, I'm not going to subscribe to any narrative. I'm going to go speak truth and candor and do it with grace and with honesty. And it's just awesome. So that leaves me with one final question. Batya, your name means daughter of God. You are speaking to people that believe in God and love God and believe God wants them to love others. Can you maybe leave our listeners with one final piece of advice from your perspective, from where you've seen the world and this country be hateful and loving and everything in between? Give us one final piece of wisdom on how we can make a difference, like the parable of the Good Samaritan, in the lives of people that need it so much right now.
It's a really good question. I'll say 2 things. The first is when you see something about people you disagree with that really fits the worst thing you already think about them, just take a minute and do a little more research before arriving at your conclusion or allowing it to add to, your confirmation bias. Like, oh yeah, I knew they would do that. Just take a minute and see if there's another angle. You could see it from, in the Jewish tradition. In Hebrew, we call that being dan l'kaf zchus. Like, see if there can't be some way to give them the benefit of the doubt, just for a minute. It could be that they're just as dastardly as you think, and they did do that thing and they did say that thing. But I would say just try to take a moment and think, well, maybe I'm getting that wrong. Maybe that headline is not accurate. Maybe there's another explanation. I think that's very much God's work right now in America, and a very easy thing you can do every single day to unite us and make us a healthier nation. And the second thing I would say is, I'm not one of these people who thinks one of the political parties has like the moral high ground, but I would say wherever you are, whoever you vote for, you guys have a lot of influence, a lot. The Republicans really are captive to you. And I would urge you to wield that power and to try to make America a more compassionate place. Like, give the Democrats a real run for their money. On, they portray themselves as the good guys. Like, make them fight for that. Like, I would love to see them getting competition, in terms of like policies that really confer dignity on the vulnerable. I would just love to see that coming out of your community.
That's great.
That was awesome.
Thank you guys so much. This was so
Batya, what a pleasure. Dan and I said when we were talking to Reverend Salguero, we said we were going to New York to experience the food.
Yep.
Do you remember that, Dan?
I do remember that.
Sometime post-quarantine, Batya, Dan and I will join you in Brooklyn for a good meal. So this has just been incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us and with our audience.
Yes.
And praying for your safety there in Brooklyn, and pray you have a really blessed Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too. All the best.
Thank you, Batya.
Well, that's it for today, everyone. This is David Henriksen with my co-host,
Dan Riveros.
Happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you next time on the Walking Through Samaria podcast.
Have a good one.
For more content like this, visit us at givingcompany.com. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Walking Through Samaria.